Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Greetings and welcome to another episode of Canadian History X. Before I continue, I want to welcome the newest patron of the show, Randy McCallum. If you want to become a patron, you can for as little as $3 a month. Just go to patreon.com/CanadaEHX. You can also donate to the podcast by going to CanadaEHX.com and clicking Donate. Don't forget, I have two other podcasts out there, Pucks and Cups and From John to Justin, available on all podcast platforms. Today I'm speaking with author and historian Chad Reimer, who wrote the excellent book, The Trials of Albert Strobel. It's a really interesting book that looks at two trials that took place in the late 19th century in British Columbia, centered on Albert Strobel and the accusation of murder. It's a wonderful book. It takes a look at the frontier of British Columbia just as civilization was starting to creep in, and I highly recommend it. So let's get right to the interview. First question is, what drove you to write this book on Albert Strobel?
Well, I was actually doing research on another project, which is the subject of a book that hopefully will come out soon, and that is the lynching of an Indigenous boy in Seamass around this time in the 1880s. And as I was researching, I wanted to do the context and see if there were other local murders and violence and so forth. And I came across this instance, which I'd never heard before. And I saw that there was a good amount of material, documents on it, transcripts from the trials, which is rare to get. And the more I got into it, the more it interested me. So it's one of those, serendipitous kind of things, right?
Mm-hmm. What was the research process like? You mentioned that there was quite a bit of information. Was it difficult to find some of the information that you wanted, given that it was the late 1800s?
Well, the newspapers covered it well, so that was good. When the first trial was in New Westminster, and so they covered it. And then the second trial was in Victoria. And they often covered it almost verbatim, because it was quite common for the judge to ask a reporter to keep the official transcript and just hand it in to him. So journalists were used to this. Also, it was the big events. Like it was like, I don't know, Bridgerton or something. Which I only got through there's a couple of episodes of that. But anyway, it was their drama in the cities. And so readers read it and lined up to go to the trials. So that was a really good source. That's what I saw first. And then I got digging more and more into the archives. And the research it's always creative. I mean, people think they can just Google it and find it, but that's not quite how it goes. For one, how do you spell Strobel? If you don't search it in the various different ways, mm-hmm. or you don't know where to look, then you'll miss stuff. But I was pleasantly surprised that, I found one transcript of one trial, and I found another transcript of the other trial, and then yet another one off in Ottawa. And so, in between easy and hard, easy if you know where to look, and quite fortunate in that there was stuff left. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like being a, history detective sort of thing, where nobody's written about this before. And mm-hmm. that's what interests me, keeps me going.
Now, there's quite a unique cast of characters in this whole thing. One that really stood out for me was David Lucas, who
Yes.
was not a savory character. um, he had some issues with him reading that book for sure. Was there anybody who especially stood out for you in the book?
Well, Lucas was, yes, he was the no, more than a gadfly. I mean, it was fascinating connecting him to, the context that emerged and so forth. Of course, like Strobel himself was interesting in a kind of sad, tragic way. Their life experiences were fascinating, in terms of family moving around, which is not uncommon. Families losing parents early, which also wasn't uncommon. Um, Big, groups of siblings have to go do it on their own. Uh, Very, very little education, and just kind of in the midst of this notion that I just need the one break to make a go of it, right?
Mhm.
And the land's out here so there's this seeming opportunity. So these characters that are working in this environment, it's interesting because the difference between making it and not is very, very thin. So
Mhm.
they are living. I mean, they're at the end of the so-called frontier, and they're also, living on the edge of making it or completely failing, which would mean poverty.
Mhm.
So, and then there, side characters like David Airley, who was a little psychopath in the making. Uh,
Yes.
I think he did serve time later for armed robbery and such. So,
Not
uh,
surprised.
yes, yeah, like I said, out on the frontier, you get, when it's the end of the road, you get the end of the road people.
Mhm.
And so interesting things happen.
Absolutely. When you were writing it, was it hard to separate fact from fiction? Because a few times you mentioned in the book, even the newspaper accounts can be very extravagant in how they describe everything going on. So was it kind of hard to figure out like what actually happened versus what people said happened?
Um, I mean, that's the root of what I'm trained to do
Mhm.
as a historian. So I have a, um, the academic background and experience. So reading documents critically is there's no single recipe for that, uh, because the documents are produced in different ways, and so when you have the documents in front of you, you always have to ask who's written them, how they produced, what, why, and so forth. And this book, I also, that's the first question about the material. The second part of the question is about my writing of it, and there's no doubt that I had a lot of fun in this book because we don't know, we do know a bit, more about Albert Strobel than we would ever know if he hadn't
Mhm.
been up for murder. We would never have known it. We don't know anything about the victim because he was dead and they didn't have to look into his life. Don't even know his name. Like David Marshall was just the one he took on.
Mhm.
But I wanted to string together the factual stuff, which was quite a bit. And everything in the book that I say happened.
Mhm.
Everything when I say, well, he thought this, that's it's obviously a speculation because he wasn't
Mhm.
keeping a diary of what he thought. But of course, all writing does that.
Yeah.
But this book, I took a more uh, dramatic, um, not even liberties, but I wanted to make it a compelling story. It was a compelling story, but just, the straight factual thing would be dry because so much is missing.
Mm-hmm.
And, I would say when I would, some scenes, I would say, well, this is the most likely thing that happened when so-and-so visited him in his hotel room, spoke to him. The other things the major things that happen, I'm not speculating.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what happened in what actually happened that night. Well, nobody knows. Nobody knows why. But
Mm-hmm.
what I say is based on the facts.
Right.
What Strobel is thinking when he's taking his girl for a walk, well,
For sure.
So, I think the reader will say, well, yeah, that's that. You can tell. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's a reasonable speculation. That's a far out speculation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do too many of those, but every so often, it's kind of fun. But it's not. It's somewhere between a historical dramatization and just straight history.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Now, in the book, where Albert at first doesn't confess, and then after the trials, he does confess, but then there's even speculation that he's just trying to go for the self-defense. So you never really know if he did this or not. In your opinion, do you think he actually did commit the murder?
Well, I do have that section where I say what I think happened because I obviously I like reading true crime, not overly much, but still, and I hate it when the author doesn't say what they think happened.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. It's like, okay, you can let the reader decide, and then in your final chapter, you can say, this is what I think happened. Because the author, I hope, has formed some opinions. Because otherwise it's a cop-out,
Mm-hmm.
Like, put it out there. Come on. And I do spend a bit of time saying what happened. I don't want to go into too much because the drama does. There's no doubt he's alone in that house and he takes a loaded pistol into that house.
Mm-hmm.
And the two of them are alone, and one of them has a loaded pistol, and the other dies of a gunshot wound. And so it's obvious.
Yeah.
Why? Or, even the judge doesn't know.
Mm-hmm.
And the judge was highly prejudicial against Strobel. Even the judge says, I don't know what happened.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There was a fight. Who caused it? I don't know. And see there, and so, yeah, he shot him.
Mm-hmm.
But why? And
Yeah.
how? And the tragedy, of course, is that he could have pretty much got away with it if he had wanted to. If he had had enough, if he had thought enough about it, right? Because he could have made up any story he wanted and said, oh, he was, bad mouthing my girl. And then there's other witnesses that said, yeah, that's what he did. And he was Portuguese. He was, Portuguese was one of the bad thing, really bad things to be. If you're going to be European, being Portuguese is probably the worst. And that's so.
Mm-hmm. One of the most irritating things reading that was the judge and just how he was asking questions. And so if that trial were held today, because the two trials change in the criminal code happens in between, like there's so much that happens. If it were held today, do you think it would have the same outcome?
It would be very, very different in the sense that certain pieces of evidence, like the gun, would, the way it was gotten would not have been admitted, under false pretenses. It's difficult to say because they have forensics. and they have a lot more international cooperation. So it would have taken nothing for the integrated murder squad to call up their colleagues in the States and swap back forensic evidence and them to get warrants for searching for the gun. And so today, with the new methods, they might have got the gun anyway. If they had gotten the gun today, if they had gotten the gun the way they got it back then, it would have been tossed out as all the clues. And of course, the thing with the judge is that if the judge was as prejudicial today as he was back then it would have been tossed out on appeal.
Yeah.
But Strobel was only the second defendant for a serious crime, was only the second defendant in British Columbia to testify in his own defense. The first had happened the week before with the same prosecutor. So actually the prosecutor had experience questioning the defendant. But the judges, nobody knew what the rules were. Was the judge allowed to do what he did with the defendant? And he's not.
No.
He's not. But it was a brand new rule, and nobody knew what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. And there were no appeal courts. That's what people don't understand either. There was the Supreme Court, but almost everything that made it to the Supreme Court pertained to commercial law. And so there was no, if Strobel's lawyer wanted to appeal the verdict, there was no way to do it. So I think he would have been found guilty of manslaughter in all likelihood. Yeah.
What was the, like, when you look at the first trial and he's acquitted, or I guess not guilty, and then the second trial he's found guilty, what's the biggest factor? I mean, there's tons. There's Lucas being, a bit more prepared for the second trial. There's the judge. There's the words of Strobel being essentially used against him in the second trial. But what's the biggest factor in that guilty verdict for Albert in the second trial, do you feel?
The biggest factor, the judge said the biggest factor, like when he wrote private correspondence to the justice minister, he said the biggest factor was the identification of the bullet to the gun. It was the first time a specific bullet was linked to a specific gun in the minds of the jury. And so the ballistic experts were, the first guy who was used before, he was better prepared. And they used the second guy who went too far. Essentially, he said, yes, I can make that link when he can't.
Yeah.
So there's that link. There's also the fact, the second trial is longer than the first. And the first has two defendants. So it shows you just how much longer and how much more prepared the prosecutor. And the problem with the first trial was that they insisted on charging David Airlie along with Strobel, because they thought that Airlie's confession that they had done it together was a slam dunk. Because in that era, when they would talk about direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. Now, to us, what direct evidence means is physical scientific evidence. That's not what it meant back then. What it meant back then was witnesses who witnessed, and that was their direct evidence. And so they had the most important thing, a witness, and they just couldn't. This was mostly the policeman's fault, Moresby. They just couldn't see that this guy was just bonkers. He was, and when he was on the stand, he was back and forth. And so because the prosecutor had linked the case against Strobel to the confession, and to Airlie. And because the confession went down in flames, it was too late to repair the damage.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the jury had said, well, if the first guy's innocent, this next guy, I know there's separate evidence, but, I'm not convinced. So
Yeah.
I think it was 6-6 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the prosecutor got a break when they had the trial a week later.
Mm-hmm.
Just moved it to Victoria.
With reading the book, what do you hope people get out of reading the book?
Well, a good read. I mean, when I go for pick up a book, it's to enjoy myself.
Mm-hmm.
I want them to enjoy themselves with it. To be surprised at the end too. So I try that as well. And then, not be too laden with this other stuff to take the fun away, but just to appreciate what it was like back then, for someone like Albert Strobel, with a broken up family, with no resources, not just money resources, but educational resources, no family network, no anything. And, obviously intellectually challenged, developmentally challenged, taken advantage of. And, that it was pretty harsh. We want to think back in the pioneer days and all the opportunity, even the hardest working people that played by all the rules and, stuck with their families. It was a hard go.
Yeah.
So, and how recent that was. I mean, for me, it's, for a historian, that's, 120, 130 years ago, 120,
Mm-hmm.
30 years ago, is not a long time ago. That's my grandpa was born in 95. So that's just after all this takes place. And and this really was the end. I mean, of the last of the frontier. Well, not the last of the frontiers. Actually, in a lot of ways, frontier lasted in northern BC, for instance, northern parts of Canada until the 50s,
Mm-hmm.
1950s, really. You had some first contact with Native peoples in the 1950s.
Yeah.
Just how young Canada is, how recent all this stuff was, and just to, that kind of, it's not a costume drama because I can't costume them up, but, I mean, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently, and it just that kind of enjoyment and learning of traveling to another time. Um, it's worth a good read for that.
Absolutely. And then the last question is, where can people find the book? Where can they get it? Find you if they have questions or anything like that.
Well, Amazon sells it. Anything, if you want to forward any questions or whatever, you can go to email to Caitlin Press. Find their, go online and find their website. And I think it's CAITLIN. I don't think it's LYN. My niece is LYN.
It's IN. Yeah. No.
I get them mixed up. Is it the Y or the I at the end? Anyway, and so, Caitlin Press, and contact them if you have questions. You can order the book, I believe, directly from them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the same price as going on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And Amazon both in Canada and the States covers it. So notice that I'm stressing the ways in which you can buy the book. Now you can also, I'm sure public libraries might have it as well, but it's certainly worth buying the book.
Of course, yeah. And it's a great read. So
check the public library too. I think some of the eastern ones, I picked it up. Of course, in BC, quite a few of the public libraries have them as well.
I hope you enjoyed that interview, and if you did, please leave a rating and review. If you like, you can reach me through email at craig@canadaehx.com. You can also visit my website where you'll find hundreds of articles on Canada's history as well as all my podcast episodes. Just go to canadaehx.com. And don't forget, you can support the podcast through Patreon. There are multiple tiers to choose from, all with great benefits. You can support the podcast for as little as $3 a month, just like all of these wonderful patrons have, and I apologize if I mispronounce any names. Randy McCallum, Diane Wade, Lori-Ann Kirby, Gary Dolovich, Nick Zinri, Pamela Elder, Shannon Marshall, Clinton Martinez, Dimitri Shove, Aaron O'Hara Myers, Robert Dunseith, Todd Casey, Catherine Roy, Luke S., J.P. Bear, Jason Hall, Phil Maynard, and Iris Gray. If you want, you can find me on Facebook. Just go to facebook.com/CanadianHistoryX. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is Craig Baird, CraigBeard. And you can find me on Instagram. Just go to Bairdo37. Thanks. We'll see you again next time.